Hello everyone, my name is Kaze and today I'm going to be starting a video series on some of the game design aspects of some of the video games I'm playing. Why do I want to talk about game design? Well, I have a bachelor's degree in video game design and I graduated in 2008, so I feel that I want to talk about game design in general, and that's just how I feel. So to start off, I'm going to be talking about the narrative and the story in Destiny, and some of the writing as well. So first off, the game industry doesn't really have a good history when it comes to story, like writing and storytelling games, and we need to understand that the writing in a video game is not just like the dialogue. The writing can include the text that you see in the UI, and the items that you pick up, and the lore that you'll be reading along the way. And also, we need to understand that games are not just, it's not just a story. We need to look at the narrative. And the narratives is sort of like the whole, whereas story, the lore, the character design, the sound, they're the parts of the narrative. And the narrative is the whole. We need to separate what we call story and narrative, because I think a lot of gamers on YouTube, on Twitch, are not using the words properly. So when I hear people say story, they're usually referring to the campaign story or like the main single player storyline or the plot. But sometimes they use the word narrative. What they really mean is like the plot of the story. When I'm using the word narrative, I'm including the character design, the UI, the dialogue, and the plot of the game. Remember, it's the whole. And so when it comes to writing in video games, it's overall very hard. When you see sort of games like Mass Effect, which I enjoyed, Mass Effect uses a morale choice system where you're making good and bad choices, and that makes sort of the writing very complicated because you have to write for multiple scenarios. Also, the art of the game itself can influence what gets written and what's put into the narrative and the story of a game. There's also the programming, how the game is programmed as far as gameplay, as far as level design. And a lot of times in the video game industry, people who write for games aren't accustomed to writing for an interactive medium. They come from outside the industry and they don't really understand that the way games tell stories, they tell their narrative, is not simply through like cutscenes that you would see in like a movie. And there are many ways to convey, as I said before, a game's narrative. It's through the mechanics of the game, the level design, what you see in the textures and environments, even the sound design can influence like what a narrative is. So what we always need to remember is that the mechanics of the game should drive the narrative and also reinforce the narrative. I think a good example of this is like BioShock Infinite. Many of the narrative aspects, like listening to the audio files, the environments, the dialogue, the background dialogue that you'll hear, it's all like one thing, part of the narrative, and you get that. But at the same time, also have a really great plot that the character sort of driving through. So in rating this to Destiny, I feel that even though there's a lot of narrative, it's not very strong. When I hear people say Destiny has a great story, they're usually referring to the lore of Destiny, and the lore of Destiny is in the Grimoire cards. Now, I don't consider the lore of a game part of the plot line of the story that the player is going through each mission or each story element. Lore, in my opinion, is added information that enhances the player's experience while providing extra information so that as the player goes through each story element and they learn something about the characters around them or the world around them, they can go back to the lore and expand their knowledge about what they're playing and in the world that they're in. Lore shouldn't be the basis of the plot line in Destiny. What you'll see in the Grimoire cards are somewhat like short stories or like sort of information tidbits about sort of the background of Destiny, some of the history, some of the characters that are in the tower that you'll learn about, or characters that have like, or like even like stories about weapons, like Thorn, you'll learn about. So, one of my major criticisms of Destiny in terms of the plot line is that there isn't much of a plot to begin with. And some people are referring to that as, the story. In my opinion, Bungie seems to want to tell the narrative of Destiny in sort of an episodic kind of way, where we have like the main game of Destiny and then the DLCs act as additional episodes to them. Even though they're calling it expansions, I think like the plot line that the player is going through are kind of like episodes, each with their own sort of narrative that they're telling. And I don't think that Bungie has accomplished this. When we think of storytelling in other games, especially like narrative driven games like RPGs, like the action adventure games and the point and click adventure games, they have their character development, and they have a beginning, middle, and end. So when we come to Destiny, you start off as a guardian who wakes up from the dead, doesn't really know who he or she is, and is basically just tossed into this guardian role without any real motivation as to why they should do what they're doing. And then you have the mission where you have Rasputin, and then there's missions on the moon about, the Traveler's Shard, then there's the Exo Stranger, all those things. And you meet Tikabal, you meet the Queen and her brother. You have all these different characters that they don't really develop, and even in the short amount of time that we're with them, there's no indication that we can really understand them. And as far as the enemy is concerned, I'm probably going to make another video about that, but to keep it short, many of the enemies that you face are really gameplay mechanics enemies. They serve the purpose of being enjoyed, being able to shoot. When you're shooting a ball in the head, it's fun. But the enemies in Destiny are not narrative enemies. Those things are very different. Narrative enemies have motivations and things like that. So I'll probably talk more about that later. Now, when it comes to the plot line of Destiny, there doesn't really feel like a beginning, middle, and end. And the Grimoire cards aren't really adding to your experience when you're completing each story mission. It's more of, here's the enemy, go shoot it, and then you're done, and then there's possibly a cutscene. And then that's it. There's nothing really rewarding about completing a mission other than earning like the experience. And I think that's part of the problem in the way Bungie has constructed their plot line. Not a lot of information, not a lot of motivation either. It's really just, point and shoot, which on the one hand, it's not a bad thing. I mean, Destiny is, what Bungie says, a shared world, first-person shooter. And in general, first-person shooters are on the low end of having a story that's sort of well thought out. Most first-person shooters are very simplistic. Call of Duty, the main campaign is, it's very action packed. The enemy's very simple. You go after them, you shoot, and that's it. And that's what Destiny kind of is, as far as the plotline is concerned. Story is even harder when it comes to like multiplayer kinds of games when you're adding more people, because when you're going to a level, the level has to restart as in enemies are loaded into the world again as more people are into the world, and when you exit, levels off. So for example, in Mass Effect, when you go into a level, you usually don't go back. There's not a lot of backtracking in Mass Effect. At least I don't remember. But when you go to a level and you complete it, you don't go back. So multiplayer games are definitely on the lower end of storytelling in games, whereas RPGs, action adventure, and point and click adventure games are on the high end of storytelling. They are definitely story driven games with gameplay mechanics that help drive that narrative. So I think overall, Destiny does have a story. It's just poorly. I think it's poorly written, and there's really no sense of motivation for what you're doing other than here's the enemy and shoot, which is not a bad thing. But to say that Destiny has this grand story and it's going to be told, I doubt it. The Grimoire cards are interesting to look at and to read, but without a foundation within the main campaign story, the lore seems flat. And games can't really tell their story through like these different segments of gameplay and cutscenes and the lore. It's all got to work together in order for it to feel right. That's my opinion on it. I'm going to be talking more about some of the different elements, like some of the enemies. I'm also going to be talking about some of the gameplay that I do enjoy. So this is just like the first part. Hope you guys enjoyed it. So please rate, comment, and subscribe. I hope to hear your guys' opinions as well. And I'll see you guys later.